Zoroastrianism has got to be one of the most intriguing religions I've read about in a long time, particularly reading about it as a Christian. Tell me if you think any of this sounds familiar. There's one God who is over everything, and it is idolatrous and misguided to worship multiple gods. The one true God who made the world is greatly displeased when we practice polytheism. He would like us to put away those false gods and worship him alone. Also, moral evil is in the world, and we as humans are torn between our knowledge that we should do good and our tendency to do evil. The one true God wants us to do what is good, in keeping with his design for us, but there's a spiritual enemy who wants us to take the path of evil instead. So we could call it a dualism of good and evil in the universe, except those two paths aren't equal because the spiritual enemy isn't of equal or even similar ontological level with the creator God. So even though it's a dualistic conflict of good and evil, it's not a conflict between two equal forces or two sides of a coin or something. In contrast, it's a temporary situation and it's not at all uncertain how it's going to end. Sound familiar? All right, well, let's keep it going. So the creator God is symbolically associated with fire. And the creator God, even though it's very important that he is one God, but yet that creator God also has a mysterious plurality of essence. In the worship of this God, it's very important to practice prayer and meditation. It's important to keep the ritual flame burning in the temple. It's important to recognize the festivals, to pour out drink offerings as appropriate. And also, as part of initiation into this religion, there's a ceremonial washing, which is to be followed by being dressed in white garments. Now, before you get too excited, let me also make sure I add that within this religion, it's very important that when somebody dies, we lift up their dead bodies onto these flat-topped towers so that we can expose their corpses to the elements until the birds and the wind and everything have had a go at them. And to do anything less than that would be a bit spiritually insufficient. But that last bit notwithstanding, there is so much about this ancient religion that is so startlingly familiar from a Christian point of view that I find it just absolutely fascinating to read about. I was actually noting to myself a couple weeks ago when I was reflecting on some of the articles that I was reading. I was kind of reflecting to myself and thinking, you know what? If I had never heard of this religion and if I saw it depicted in a fantasy novel, for example, I would probably assume this was the author's fanciful allegorical depiction of Christianity with, atmospheric elements and tonal bits added for artistic flair and stuff like that. But actually, it's not a fictional adaptation of Christianity for a fantasy novel. This is actually one of the major world religions associated with the axial age in the history of religion. And and more than that, this is a belief system that real people have willingly suffered persecution and mistreatment for their commitment to. Now, I used the word world religion a minute ago. I mean world religion in the historical sense, even though in a sense you could say it's not really one of the world religions, quote unquote, in a certain sense now, in terms of having large numbers of participants in our modern world. But it's definitely one of the historical world religions that goes back to the axial age. Anyway, so let's dive into this a little deeper. Let me share some of the stuff that I've been learning about this fascinating religion. So the rest of this video is going to be my kind of lightweight research paper, basically, that I put together, mostly based on 7 or 8 entry-level resources, and I'll put my bibliography at the end of the video as well as in the description. So the articles that I ended up finding most interesting were actually 2 Bible dictionary articles, not a place that I would expect to find a good article on a world religion, but it's just what happened when I typed in Zoroastrianism into my Logos library and these 2 articles popped right up. Now, the reason I found these articles more interesting than a lot of the other ones, well, it's partly because they were really short and concise and they emphasized a lot of the elements that particularly stand out from a Christian point of view. But these articles also stood out because they are coming from an academic Christian comparative religion point of view, whereas most of the other articles I read were coming from a more of a secular comparative religious point of view. So, in other words, perspectives that presuppose the inauthenticity of the Christian tradition. And then that's going to have a significant trickle-down effect on that author's interpretation of the history of religion as a whole and the study of comparative religion in particular. And it especially is going to trickle down to shape what you want to do with the fuzzier parts of ancient history where the evidence is relatively scarce as far as what actually happened. So the first article was this really nice, short and concise 4-paragraph article in the Erdman's Bible Dictionary, which emphasizes some theological elements. And since it's so short and concise, I thought it would be nice to just kind of read the article and we can discuss it as we go. And I'll be bringing in stuff from some of the other articles I was reading as we go through it. So this article is by Paul Redditt, an Old Testament scholar with a PhD from Vanderbilt University who has published widely on Old Testament studies. And I think also just from what I could see, just based on a quick Google search trying to get an idea, it seems like he also spent a large part of his career teaching religious studies and world religions at the undergraduate and graduate level, which would explain why he was chosen to write this particular article here. And this particular publication that I'm getting it from was published in the year 2000. So the dictionary entry starts off and says Zoroastrianism, the religious tradition that bears the name of its prophetic founder, Zoroaster, Greek Zoroastres, originating from Persian Zarathustra. This religion survives today primarily in Iran and India. Now, in regard to the name, I thought it was interesting as I went through the various articles. It seems that Zarathustra is the closest pronunciation to the original, at least for us as English speakers. A lot of resources write it out as Zarathustra with a sh in it, which I'm assuming is probably even closer to the original, but it makes it kind of harder to pronounce for me at least, Zarathustra. um, but anyway, for me, this is just completely subjective, but for me, somehow, Zarathustra or Zarathustra it sounds a lot more like a name as opposed to when I hear Zoroaster, or especially the religion name Zoroastrian. That just makes me think of like astrology or fortune telling for some reason or other. I'm just entirely talking about connotation, just like how it hits my ear. But anyway, it does kind of make me prefer the older, more authentic version to prefer to say Zarathustra, which has a different connotation. It just sounds different to my ear. It sounds more ancient. But anyway, in addition to that, apparently what they call themselves, at least according to the New World Encyclopedia, they call themselves by other names. The New World Encyclopedia lists three. Apparently they call themselves Zartushti, which I'm guessing is just a different pronunciation, is it? Because you see some of the same consonants are in there. Mazdayasni, which means wisdom worshippers. And they call themselves Beldini, which means followers of the good religion. And then a different resource, the World History Encyclopedia, also references the terms Mazdayasana, devotion to Mazda, and Mazdaism. And you might notice the common denominator in a lot of these, you might notice Mazda keeps coming up in different forms. That's because the one true God for these people is called Ahura Mazda, which the New Jewish Encyclopedia translates for us as the wise Lord. I think Ahura means Lord or God or something like that. So it seems that the special name for God in this religion is a name that emphasizes his wisdom. Might remind you a little bit of the expression in Romans 16:27, the only wise God. So apparently for the Zoroastrians, that's actually God's name. So much so that you can see why it might seem a little more appropriate for the religion to be referred to as something like Mazdaism or Mazdayasana. Now, here's an interesting question. How important is it for you that God, the one God, is wise? The English word God conjures up all kinds of different images for different people. Maybe the biggest image for a lot of Westerners would be the image of this big booming voice and this great big powerful being. Meanwhile, the English form of the name Jesus for a lot of people tends to conjure up images of this kind of soft, gentle kindness and love, certainly, maybe love without a backbone. But and then for other people, the word God might conjure up just kind of this image of this kind of mysterious essence that's just kind of out there in which we don't know anything about, but it just kind of fills in all the cracks of the universe in this great mysterious way. But it seems that the Apostle Paul in the New Testament maybe would agree that God is Mazda. He is Ahura Mazda, whatever Ahura means. Seems like it means God or Lord or something like that. But for us as Christians, this becomes important because God isn't just, let's say, omnipotent and omniscient, the two most popular theological terms probably in the whole English language, but he's not just omnipotent and omniscient. Those two don't capture the essence of God. This is part of the conundrum of the book of Job in the Old Testament. God is omnipotent and omniscient. But what does it mean, asks Job and Eliphaz and all the rest, what does it mean that God is omnisapient, all wise? What does that mean for us? Now, speaking of Job and the omnisapience of God, I thought it was absolutely fascinating when I was reading the article in the New World Encyclopedia, and they provided a citation from Yasna 44, verses 4 through 5 in the Avesta. The Avesta is the Zoroastrian scriptures. Apparently, this passage says, "This I ask thee, tell me truly, Ahura, or God, who upholds the earth beneath and the firmament from falling? Who the waters and the plants? Who yoked swiftness to the winds and clouds? Who is, O Mazda, who is creator of good thought? This I ask thee, tell me truly, Ahura, what artist made light and darkness? What artist made sleep and waking? Who made morning, noon, and night that call the understanding man to his duty? Now, what's fascinating about this passage is how remarkably similar it sounds to Job 38 and 39, the words of God in response to Job. The difference is that in the book of Job, these words are spoken from God to Job. And in this passage here from the Avesta, it sounds like these are the words of Zarathustra spoken to God, but saying a lot of things quite similar. And both of these, I think, remind us when the cruelty or chaos of the world, or maybe the greatness of man or the greatness of evil in the world, when all these things seem to press in about us, a passage like this reminds us there is someone who is great, somebody who is prior to and above and beyond everything. And this being, this entity, is omnisapient. He is, in a word, Mazda, the only wise God. And while the curtain of dark mystery drapes over everything that I could possibly try to see around me, yet I can relax in memory of the one who is greater and greatest, and whose will can be trusted even if there's chaos around me. Which allows us to say, with Job's wisdom poem from Job 28, God looks to the end of the earth and sees everything under the heavens. He considered wisdom and evaluated it. He established it and examined it. He said to mankind, the fear of the Lord is this, wisdom. And to turn from evil is understanding. All right, well, so that was just a little bit of a detour there, just on the name of Zoroastrianism versus Mazdaism or Mazdiasna, or one of those other names. So anyway, so that article, it goes on and it says, so it said the religious tradition that bears the name of its prophetic founder, Zoroaster, survives today primarily in Iran and India. And it goes on and it says, Zoroastrianism arose as a result of a dual migration of Aryans, one into Iran, the land of the Aryans, the other into India, sometime before 1000 BCE. Now, regarding the date, this is an interesting kind of tangled web to untangle. The number 1000 is definitely the number you bump into the most, but Winfred Corduan, the author of the other article that I mentioned, he makes the case that an earlier date of closer to the 6th century BC makes just as much sense, and he makes a pretty good case for that. The New World Encyclopedia summarizes the variance of different scholarly opinions by saying Zarathustra lived sometime between the 6th century BC and the 18th century BC, with the consensus placing him at about 1000 BC. And the date does end up being kind of important once you realize that claims made often about Zoroastrianism being the source for or the origin of certain key concepts in Christianity or Judaism. That claim is made fairly often, peppered, here around in what you read. But there are a lot of assumptions baked into that claim. The earliest standard date that I tend to run into for Zoroastrianism, the 18th century, that's still later than Abraham, who we as Christians tend to think of as being kind of the first big name in terms of the return to monotheism in the early axial age. The New World Encyclopedia lists the traditional date for Abraham as being between 2166 and 1991 BCE, and the highly secularist Britannica Encyclopedia lists Abraham as living in the early second millennium BCE, quote unquote. Though elsewhere, Britannica gives a window from 2000 to 1501 BCE for Abraham. But, so anyway, it would seem to be fairly well agreed that Abraham, at least probably, predated Zoroaster. But then you also have to keep in mind that another assumption within the secularist kind of evolution of religion type of perspective, another assumption within that general viewpoint would be that a lot of the things in the account of Abraham contained in the book of Genesis would be inauthentic. So that's the other thing that factors in there. But here's where things get a little dicey. So the hard evidence for Zoroastrianism is relatively late. And the dating of a lot of things back in the early axial age ends up being fairly contested because there's not as much hard evidence for it. So when you see these kind of great sweeping claims, such as this one from the New World Encyclopedia that says, according to scholars, Zoroastrianism was the first religion to believe in angels, a day of judgment, a Satan figure, and an ongoing battle between forces of light and darkness in the cosmos. That's a quote from the New World Encyclopedia. So when you see great big sweeping claims like that, there's just a lot of dominoes that kind of line up to make that work. Most noticeably regarding the claim about being the first religion to believe in angels. Uh, from a Christian point of view, it would be kind of hard to tell the story of the life of Abraham as contained in Genesis without any mention of angels. So, so in other words, to make a claim like that work, you really have to have all the cards lined up just perfect to make it work. And it seems to be the case that if you prefer, you could instead line up the cards to say that Zoroastrianism emerged as late as the 6th century BC, which would be 1400 years after Abraham. So then, by far contrast, to say with confidence that Judaism or Christianity inherited their most important beliefs from Zoroastrianism, it seems that, as at least as far as I'm concerned, it seems that that turns out not to be so much an argument, so much as being a conclusion. Maybe another way to put it would be that that conclusion is really it's really a corollary of the rest of the beliefs of the person that's making that assertion. Anyway, so let's get back to that Erdman's article. So it says Zoroastrianism occurred as a result of a dual migration of Aryans, one into Iran and the other into India, sometime before 1000 BC. It says the Western Aryans were polytheistic, their most important gods being sun, moon, stars, earth, fire, water, and wind. Their chief god was Mithra, god of war, light, and loyalty. Religious rituals included lighting a fire, pouring out haum juice as libation, and cereal or animal sacrifice. I find this description of local polytheism prior to Zarathustra, I find this description absolutely fascinating, particularly because of how it ties into the biblical accounts of the history of religion. Now, I don't know how this interrelates with other ancient cultures and ancient religions, but one of the things that stood out to me, first of all, notice how their most important gods were the elements, sun, moon, and stars, etc., which might draw your mind to Romans 1, verses 19 through 23, which describes the original religious deterioration of civilization as happening along the line of original universal assumption of the knowledge of the one true God, which transitions through ungratitude and lack of worship or recognition. It transitions into forgetfulness. And then after the period of forgetfulness, idolatry was the way in which people began to channel their sensus divinitas, their inner awareness of God that can be triggered through the sense of the transcendence and things that God has kind of built into different parts of the world and different parts of our psyche. It's in light of that Romans 1 passage that I tend to think a good definition of idolatry would be the misattribution of the sensus divinitas, resulting in delusional worship and resulting in vulnerability to the deception of evil spirits. That's what I think idolatry, a good general definition of idolatry would be. The misattribution of the sensus divinitas, resulting in delusional systems of worship and resulting in vulnerability to the deception of evil spirits. And then in Romans 1, eventually, what that leads to in Romans 1, the delusion becomes the laughable form of idolatry in which the images of four-legged creatures or images of men are worshipped as divine. Of course, these will be golden images, which adds to the kind of sense of transcendence and the wonder that it produces in us. But what makes it laughable and what's intended in the Bible, we're supposed to be noticing the absurdity, is when this is a four-legged creature like a cow. There's something absurd about worshiping something that looks like a cow. But anyway, so the earliest stage of that journey of idolatry, the earliest stage we would assume would include the deification of those elements that most naturally trigger that sense of transcendence, the awareness of the greatness of God and the nearness of God, the parts of God's created order that naturally tend to trigger that sensus divinitas within us. And the first thing we might expect to be on that list would be maybe the sun, the moon, the stars, maybe the mountains, maybe the wind, things like that. And it seems like these are what the polytheistic Aryans here were worshiping. And interestingly, as with most things that trigger the sensus divinitas, the biblical authors make very strong associations between many of these things with the true God. For example, think about the sun. In 1 John and in the Gospel of John, God is the source of light, and God is light. Psalm 84:11 refers to God as a sun and a shield. And theologians throughout church history have often used the sun as a metaphor in numerous ways for some aspect or the other of the nature of God. John Chrysostom comes to my mind most immediately in some of his sermons that I read years back. And then for another example, another one of these elements here, the wind. In the book of Job, God speaks out of a whirlwind. That's definitely not a random choice there. Let's take another one, the stars. James 1 refers to God as the Father of lights, drawing a connection of association between God and the celestial bodies kind of in general. His informal title used there is not just Father, but he's the Father whom we associate with the lights. Interestingly, in James 1, the Father of lights is the God who gives every good thing that anybody receives. Every good gift comes from the Father of lights, with whom there is no shadow cast by change. God is that way forever, and we get a glimpse of that when we glimpse upward at the splendor of the open night sky, and our hearts are filled with wonder. For another example, fire. And this is one that's especially important within Zoroastrianism. God is compared to fire. And in the Old Testament, God speaks to Moses out of the flame of the burning bush, which is a fire that doesn't consume. In Hebrews 12, it says we serve God with reverence and fear because our God is a consuming fire. God is a fire that does consume. Anyway, so all that to say, these ancient polytheists prior to Zoroastrianism, they worshipped some pretty reasonable choices of parts of creation as kind of classic idolaters, you could say. They, in their ignorance and forgetfulness, they worshipped the things that tend to trigger a sense of awe and the innate sense that we have that the divine is near and that we as humans are made to be directing awe and devotion and worship toward whatever greater power this sensus divinitas is pointing toward. So these people worshiped the sun, the moon, fire, the wind, etc. They worshipped parts of creation as the descendants of those ancient people who forgot the Lord because of chronic generational turning away from the lifestyle of gratitude and worship toward the God whom they knew. And you might also notice in the second part of that description there, he points out that within that polytheistic culture prior to Zoroastrianism, they had some particular religious traditions that might sound familiar to us: lighting a fire, pouring out drink offerings, and performing cereal offerings or animal sacrifice. Each of these traditions are pretty familiar to students of the Bible, and many of them are also going to be present in the Zoroastrian religion. But I suspect these are also things that we would see in a lot of other seemingly unrelated religious traditions as well. Ritual flame and various kinds of offerings are definitely not uncommon things to find, which makes perfect sense from a Christian point of view when you notice a passage like Genesis 4:26b. This is the end of the Adam and Eve and Cain story, and it says, "At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord," which suggests that sometime between God's casual conversation with Cain at the beginning of Genesis 4, sometime between that and the birth of Seth's son Enosh at the end of chapter 4, sometime in between there, God transitioned from being the familiar family member who casually interacts with primitive humanity, like in Genesis 2 through Genesis 4a. Sometime he transitions to becoming the mysterious object of worship, who we think about when we see the splendor of the night sky. And then after that transition, apparently, somewhere around there is when the first religion begins. Religion, it seems, emerges at a point after society has emerged, larger society has emerged, and the nature of the relationship between God and humanity has transitioned into its next phase. And perhaps that first religion, that first pure monotheistic religion that fallen humanity began roughly around that time, perhaps that primal religion included the ritual use of fire and various kinds of offerings. We might guess that. And we might guess that partly because both animal sacrifice and produce offerings were present in the opening part of Genesis 4. And also, all four of these items, ritual flame, drink offerings, meal offerings, and animal sacrifice, all four of these ended up being included later, included as prescriptive in ancient Israelite worship as described in the Torah. Anyway, so back to that Erdman's article. So they describe the polytheistic Aryans, and then it says, Zoroaster apparently revised this religion along somewhat dualistic lines. In his worldview, two basic forces struggled for control of the world: Spenta Mainyu, the good spirit, and Angra Mainyu, the evil spirit. The origin of the two spirits is not clear, but Angra Mainyu seems to have come into being only with the creation of the world. Zoroaster avoided the moral dilemma of dualism, i.e., which spirit to follow. He avoided that by postulating the existence of one supreme god, Ahura Mazda, who is symbolized by fire, and to whom alone worship is due. Ahura Mazda makes his will known through spenta Mainyu. Now, when I read this description back when I was starting my research a month or so ago, when I read this over, I started getting super excited when I read that paragraph. And the reason I started getting excited is because I had always thought of Zoroastrianism kind of in the back of my head, something I wasn't super familiar with, but it was kind of floating in the back of my head as this ancient monotheistic religion built around cosmic moral dualism, kind of like Star Wars with the light side and the dark side and stuff like that. But this paragraph here makes it abundantly clear that's not Zoroastrianism. Quite the contrary, Ahura Mazda is a completely different kind of entity from Angra Mainyu. It's not that different from, in the Bible, having Yahweh God as the creator, with Satan standing off in spiritual warfare against Michael the Archangel. Now, of course, the main difference would be, as it says here, Ahura Mazda makes his will known through spenta Mainyu, whereas in Christianity, Michael the Archangel doesn't play a particular role in providing divine revelation. Also, we'll find out later on through other resources that it seems like Spenta Mainyu is connected with Ahura Mazda in a way that's kind of reminiscent of being like a seven-part trinity, but not quite. But anyway, regardless, he's definitely not Michael the Archangel. So that definitely upsets any kind of excessively tidy picture that we might, accidentally try to press onto things. But anyway, so it turns out that the kind of image that I had always assumed of Zoroastrianism from my very cursory, vague awareness, this idea of this strong dualism, it turns out that's actually closer to a Zoroastrian heresy called Zurvanism or Zurvanism, depending what resource you're looking at, depending how they spell it. So in Zurvanism, the supreme being is Zurvan or Zorvan, time. And Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu are twin brothers. So in that sense, this is more of an absolute dualism. The forces of good and evil are more like in Star Wars, these two roughly equal competing forces. Actually, the New World Encyclopedia refers to Manichaeism, the third century Christian heresy. It refers to Manichaeism as a synthesis between Christianity with Zurvanism. And then the article also gives this really fascinating observation later on in the article when it says, it is useful to note that the absolute dualism of Zurvanism, although it was dead by the 10th century, it ended up being the Zoroastrian doctrine that became the first and best known amongst European scholars through the writings of the Greek philosopher Plutarch, circa 46 through 127 CE, and that European scholars were therefore misled to conclude that Zoroastrianism was a faith of absolute dualism. End quote. And then after I copied out that quote in my notes there, then I jotted down in my note file, I wrote down, that makes so much sense. Because by that time I was having a blast with my little research project here. Anyway, so back to that Erdmann's article. After describing the cosmic good and evil balance between the good spirit and the bad spirit, with then Ahura Mazda being the creator god who's over and above everything, then it goes on with the next paragraph. It says, this belief in two spirits reflects the existential perception that humans are pulled morally in two different directions. Apparently, flesh is bad and pulls one toward Angra Mainyu, while spirit is good and pulls one toward Spenta Mainyu. Hence, humans often make the wrong moral choice and commit evil. The solution to human ills is to follow prescribed works, including worship, prayer, and moral purity, though not celibacy. Rites of passage include an initiation of all children before puberty, weddings and funerals, in which the body is wrapped in white cloth and then placed atop a tower of silence for disposal through exposure. It is never cremated, since dead flesh would contaminate the holy fire. Now, the comment on spirit and flesh might remind you a little bit of the writings of Paul and the way he uses the terms spirit and flesh. And in one sense, there is this common understanding that we as humans have these good and bad inclinations kind of at war within us. But there's also, at least in the Pahlavi form of the religion, it seems that Zoroastrianism takes it a step further by doing something kind of like what Gnosticism does in the early centuries. So according to the New World Encyclopedia, Pahlavi literature suggests that only evil spirits are capable of transmuting the spiritual to the material. In this way, material existence is considered to be inherently contaminated by the circumstances of its creation. However, this system avoids falling into spiritual pessimism because of its faith that the world of spirit will ultimately triumph. And then the final paragraph of the Erdmann's article says, Some articles see Zoroastrianism as the source of dualistic thinking in Judaism. Cyrus the Great presumably was a Zoroastrianism, though Achaemenid texts only mention Ahura Mazda, not Zoroaster. Then it says, any direct influence on the New Testament is dubious. And that's the end of the article. Very intriguing, concise, theologically oriented summary of Zoroastrianism, and great fun to bump into and zip on through. Now, one of the key and interesting bits that this article doesn't include is the story aspect of Zoroastrianism, the purported origin and early history of this religion. So, to get some of that aspect, let's jump over to that other Bible dictionary article that I mentioned, this one from the Lexham Bible Dictionary published in 2016. This particular article is written by Dr. Winfred Cordoan, who is the author of 2 introductory textbooks on world religions. He also co-authored a textbook on philosophy of religion with Norm Geisler. And this article here, it's longer than the last one we looked at quite a bit, but let's just look at those 3 paragraphs where he tells the story of early Zoroastrianism, because I really like how he tells that story. He says, legends concerning Zoroaster's life record that around age 30, he went through a personal spiritual crisis. While he was in the desert contemplating, the angel Vohumana appeared to him and conducted him into the presence of the one true God, Ahura Mazda. Here, Zoroaster received instructions on how to reform the Persian religion, what to teach the people, beginning with a monotheism focused on Ahura Mazda. These supernatural visits were repeated several times, and Zoroaster began preaching. Zoroaster's fundamental message was that there is only one God, and that people should obey him by following the light, the truth, and goodness, rather than the darkness, the lie, and evil. This message entailed a radical revision in how the gods who had previously been worshipped in Persia should be understood. For example, Zoroaster declared that the Devas, a name given to one of the 2 groups of gods in Persian religion, the Devas were actually evil demons. He further declared that only one of the Ahuras, the name given to the other group of gods or lords in Persian religion, only one of the Ahuras should be worshipped. This god was Ahura Mazda, or the Wise Lord, who battled against the evil spirit Angra. Cordovan goes on and he says, since these new monotheistic ideas could be detrimental to the material well-being of the current polytheistic priesthood, Zoroaster was severely persecuted when he first began spreading his religion. Eventually, Zoroaster was imprisoned by King Vishtaspa, whose domain would become a Persian satrapy under Cyrus. However, when the king's horse went lame, Zoroaster, the legends claim, was able to heal the animal supernaturally. Because of this miracle, the king was willing to listen to Zoroaster's message. The legends claim that the king believed and was converted, and his subjects followed suit, and after a time, Zoroastrianism began to spread over all of Persia. So that's the story of Zarathustra. And I gotta say, pretty cool story. Now, one other bit that I want to share from Cordovan's article that I think will help kind of round out our view of the Zoroastrian religion from a Christian point of view. So what about this concept of plurality within the one God? Are Zoroastrians Trinitarian? So here's a short clip from Cordovan's article on the topic. This is a part that I find absolutely fascinating. So Cordovan says, Zoroaster also taught that Ahura Mazda carried out his work by manifesting himself through 7 facets, which consist of his Holy Spirit called Spenta Mainyu and the 6 holy immortals called Amesha Spentas, sometimes referred to as angels. The 6 Amesha Spentas were to be considered aspects of Ahura Mazda himself. They are Vuhumana, good thought, Haurvatat, perfection, Asha, righteousness, Armaiti, piety, Kshatra, power, dominion, Amaratat, immortality. Now, I want to get back to Cordovan on this in a second, but first, you might have noticed Cordovan referred to these as aspects of Ahura Mazda that are sometimes called angels. Well, the New World Encyclopedia refers to them as emanations, and it says that each of them is believed to be a personified attribute of Ahura Mazda, although modern scholars of religion theorize that they may be reconceptualizations of pre-Zoroastrian deities. And then it says, these beings, through their characterizations, suggest the qualities one must cultivate if one wishes to best enjoy the fruits of salvation. End quote. So that's another angle on that with some other aspects there. But going back to Cordovan's article, so after listing the 6 Amesha Spentas, then he says, Some Zoroastrians describe Ahura Mazda, Spenta Mainyu, and the Amesha Spentas in ways that seem analogous to the Christian Trinity, though with 7 persons rather than 3, Spenta Mainyu and the 6 Amesha Spentas. However, unlike the Christian Trinity, in which all 3 parts are equal and one, Zoroastrians believe Spenta Mainyu and the 6 Amesha Spentas rank a step beneath Ahura Mazda, not only in function but also in their nature as God. All 7 of them were considered facets of a god, but Ahura Mazda, as a whole entity, exceeded them in rank and power. End quote. And then at the core of Zoroastrian way of life are their 5 principles and their motto, which I saw coming up multiple times as I read the various articles. So the motto apparently is Humata Hukta Hvarshta, good thoughts, good words, good deeds. There's something so captivating about simple threefold formulas like that, kind of like what we have in Christianity of pistis, elpis, agape, faith, hope, love. But the motto for the Zoroastrians is good thoughts, good words, good deeds. Humata hukta varshta. Gotta love it. And the 5 principles, according to the World History Encyclopedia, the 5 principles are number 1, the supreme God is Ahura Mazda. Number 2, Ahura Mazda is all good. 3, his eternal opponent, Angara Mainyu, is all evil. 4, goodness is apparent through good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. Humata hukta varshta. Number 5, each individual has free will to choose between good and evil. In the New World Encyclopedia, they explain that the choice between good and evil is the choice between asha, or truth, and druj, or lie. Which that concept there takes me over so much, takes me over to 1 John, where it's all about this contrast between the truth and the lie. I guess that concept has been popularized more recently into our popular culture through figures like Jordan Peterson, who I'm pretty sure he picked up that idea primarily from the writings of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who connected the truth and the lie. He used those in connections with ideological and cultural atrocities. Now, what about the rituals within this religion? So they have a drink offering, just like their polytheistic forebears did. They no longer have animal sacrifice. They emphasize prayer and meditation, like most monotheistic religions. And one of their most noticeable and memorable symbolic elements is their fire temple. According to History.com, Zoroastrian places of worship are sometimes called fire temples. Each fire temple contains an altar with an eternal flame that burns continuously and is never extinguished. End quote. Now, I think this is just a really cool element. You may remember that their polytheistic forebears also had rituals connected with fire. Also, you may remember that in the Torah, the lampstand in the Jewish temple is to be burning continually. Also, in Leviticus 6:12-13, the fire on the altar is to be, quote, kept burning continually. It must not go out, end quote. So it seems ancient Israel also had a continuous flame, or actually 2 different continuous flames in their temple as part of their religious ritual. The Zoroastrians associate fire with the nature of God, and also, kind of like Christians, they also associate fire with the eschaton. The details of the eschaton for them differ quite a bit from what Christianity teaches. And then one more ritual that stands out, particularly from a biblical Christian standpoint. According to the New World Encyclopedia, initiation into this religion includes a ritual bath or a ritual washing, after which you are dressed in white ritual garments. The garments are tied with a cord that is wrapped 3 times. It's wrapped 3 times, 1 time for each of the 3 virtues: good thought, good deeds, good words. Humata, hukta, hrashta. What makes this one fascinating is because of the role that ritual washings play in ancient Judaism and the role of baptism in Christianity. And the idea of having a ritual where you put on the white robes while wrapping it 1 time for each virtue, I mean, that just makes me think of, kind of hits me like what it might look like if somebody wanted to make kind of solemnly ritualize the words of Jesus when he says, your sins are forgiven you, go and sin no more. And the idea of being washed so that you're white as snow, that's something that occurs throughout the Bible. In Revelation, there are a great number of references to the redeemed being dressed in white garments. So anyway, so I think this religion is one that really is very particularly interesting for Christians to think about because of its parallels, not only parallels that are reminiscent of pre-Jewish and pre-Christian concepts, but also elements that almost kind of seem to support the Christian message in a kind of like in a way, kind of like how Jewish traditions and then even some select parts of certain parts of Greek philosophical thought kind of become intriguing analogs to Christian concepts, kind of like some of those different things. Okay, so now as we are kind of coming toward the end of this discussion here, maybe this might be an appropriate time to kind of briefly revisit the question of dating while we consider the interesting question. So, what was the original Mazdaism that Zarathustra would have originally introduced? Because, like I said, the hard evidence that we have dates to the 6th century BC, more or less, meaning that the religion at least existed at that point. Most scholars estimate that it may have begun in the 10th century BC. Cordoan argues that the 6th century BC is a really solid option for when the religion actually originally emerged. Their scriptures would have originally been transmitted orally, like a lot of scriptures. And then, unfortunately, any relatively early manuscripts that may have been had would have been lost when Alexander the Great burned Persepolis in 330 BC. Cordoan says the earliest partial manuscripts of the Avesta known to us date to the 10th century AD, while full manuscripts of the Avesta available go back no further than the 13th century AD, circa 1600 and 1900 years after Zoroaster, respectively. Thus, the actual manuscripts presumably representing early Zoroastrian beliefs are far removed from the time Zoroastrian beliefs were probably written down. End quote. So, this means that if Zarathustra did live around 1,000 years BC, then that would mean that our earliest fragments of the text are about 2,000 years removed from his life. So, roughly the same amount of time as there is between us today and the time of Jesus. And it sounds like we have no record of anything in between there to let us know how that transmission was going in between there, or to allow us to evaluate the faithfulness of the transmission of that text. And it seems that even within the Avesta that we have, there may already be some observable progression from the earlier forms to the later forms, or at least that's how the authors of the New World Encyclopedia make it sound. They say, it is difficult to describe ancient Zoroastrianism in detail. However, it is clear that the original teachings of Zarathustra were modified significantly by the prophet's disciples, which eventually lead to an acceptance of the very polytheism and ritualism that Zarathustra had originally opposed. They say the Avesta illustrates the fact that post-Zarathustra Zoroastrianism incorporated older beliefs and traditions from earlier Iranian religions while simultaneously synthesizing the new ideas Zarathustra developed in the Gathas. And they say that E.B. Taylor refers to these as archaic survivals. So I don't know what the details are of that and what we should do with that, but it's an interesting part to add to the mix, at least. So as we come toward the end here, here's an interesting question to consider. The story goes that Zarathustra was met by God sometime between 1800 and 500 BC, and God told him that God was displeased with polytheism and idolatry. And then the result of that was this religion was born that worshipped the one creator God with the symbolism of fire, with an emphasis on doing good. That all of life is this cosmic conflict between the work of the great evil spirit against us following the will of the God who made us. And the question that one might be thinking as a Christian is, well, how do I know that didn't happen? The Hebrew scriptures seem to say that Yahweh God spoke to the polytheistic Balaam, apparently, and God also apparently had an unknown priest in the days of Abraham called Melchizedek. God also seems to have allowed 3 non-Jewish, non-Christian magi from the East. God seems to have allowed them to correctly see that the divine rescuer of all humanity was taking on human flesh in the city of Bethlehem. So, while I don't personally think we have any solid reason to believe that the Mazdaism tradition accurately remembers the teachings of Zarathustra, and while I don't feel we even have a solid basis to believe that Zarathustra was even a prophet in the first place, and yet it's kind of an interesting picture to think about something like that happening in 1000 BC or 600 BC or 1500 BC. And whether it did or not, these people did get something right. The only wise God is wise. And the true eternal flame not only is there, but will go on burning with or without any fire temple or any merely human priest. In any age, whether 1,000 or 600 or 1,500 or what, in any age, some may find that our eyes as humans turn upward because they must. And perhaps sometimes the ancient human memory of the maker of mankind may surface in some unexpected places.